here with Larry Perkins again, and we are now looking at our fifth topic, actually, concerning the relationship between the Septuagint and the New Testament. And this one has to do with whether the Septuagint text and Canon could be considered normative today. So New Testament authors also appear to be drawing more generally on material that is found in our Septuagint corpus, material that is not contained, in other words, in what we know today as the Hebrew Bible or the Protestant Old Testament canon. One such example is in Romans chapter 1. It seems quite clear there that Paul is taking up or alluding to a similar depiction of non-Jews than we find in Wisdom of Solomon chapters 13 through 15. So would Romans 1 be an example of another connection between the Septuagint and the New Testament? Was there a difference between what Jews in Palestine considered as their scriptures and those in the diaspora, say in Alexandria, for example?
Yes, these are a whole series of very complex questions.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just offer the following sort of observations. In my understanding, the whole question of an Alexandrian canon that is different from a Palestinian canon is difficult. I think the work by Sundberg, done in the 1960s and published as the Old Testament of the early church, certainly challenged the assumption of an Alexandrian canon. Whether his thesis continues to be cogent or not can be debated, but I think it raises the question of whether we can presume that New Testament writers, when accessing Septuagint scrolls of various books, would have considered writings such as Wisdom or Sirach or Tobit or First Maccabees as authoritative scripture. Now again, we have to remember we don't have these materials, as it were, combined together in a single volume at the time of the New Testament, as far as we can tell. They're still separate scrolls. We don't get codices emerging of this nature until probably the end of the first century, early second century AD or CE, as the case may be. So we have to keep that in mind a little bit. And we also don't know what might have motivated the inclusion of certain documents with translated materials of the Hebrew Bible in the codices of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus and Alexandrinus, which were all put together late 4th, early 5th century, as the case may be, or what this says about their general status then within the Christian church at the time. Each of these codices has a slightly different list of materials that are put together with Septuagint documents. So again, what do these codices really say about the nature of the church's understanding of their Bible? And secondly, what can we then infer about how the use of these materials within Judaism might have been understood a number of centuries earlier? So it's complex. That's all I'm trying to suggest, right?
Right.
So in the case of New Testament writers, it seems that in some cases they certainly borrowed terminology and phrasing that is similar to certain passages. For example, Sirach 24 and verse 19 seems to be reflected in Jesus' comments in Matthew 11:28 about all those who labor and are heavy laden and coming and getting rest and so forth. And as you noted, the material out of Wisdom chapters 13 to 15 reflected in Romans chapter 1 verses 19 to 32. However, there are no citation formulae, as far as we can tell, associated with such usage, and it may be that writers and speakers were familiar with this language because, again, it had become a standard part of Jewish religious discourse, particularly in Greek-speaking contexts. The single exception in the New Testament, as far as I'm aware of, is the reference to the Enoch material in Jude 14 and 15. Now, Enoch is not generally part of the Apocrypha. It's more the pseudepigrapha material. But nonetheless, here we have a document that in some sense is being accessed with an understanding that it has some authority within the context of the discussion in Jude 14 and 15. And it does have a citation formula. To quote, now Enoch, seventh from Adam, prophesied also with regard to these, saying, look, Kyrios has come with his myriads of holy ones, etc., etc. And this seems to be taken from the text of Enoch chapter 1 and verse 9. And the author of Jude regards it as prophecy that supports his assertion that God holds the sinful people among his audience accountable, and at some time will come to judge them. Now, we do not know why the writer chooses at this point to refer to Enoch. Perhaps the writings credited to Enoch were being used by others within the audience of Jude. And so Jude quotes from that text because it has status within the discussions of that community and so forth. Whether the writer himself regarded the text of Enoch as equal in authority to other Jewish sacred texts and so forth is again difficult to discern just from the way he quotes this material. In terms of the documents in the New Testament, this citation in Jude is, as I say, a singular instance. And we do not know exactly then what to infer from it regarding the attitude of early Christian leaders towards other pseudepigraphal and apocryphal literature.
Yes, so there's lots of uncertainty in this area. It's unfortunate we do not have labels or prefaces that tell us more about these things. But the fact that the New Testament authors and church fathers predominantly quoted and worked from the Greek scriptures has led to some arguments that the Christian church should just adopt the Septuagint as its Old Testament scriptures. This is something we hear quite often nowadays. Of course, the Orthodox Church has always done this. And this was even recently argued by a few people like Mogens Mueller, who labeled the Septuagint as the first Bible of the church. So how should we approach this issue?
Yes, Mueller is correct in a certain sense that the writings that we have in the New Testament, by and large, accessed the Jewish sacred text through the Septuagint. And this is a reality. Again, in that perspective, when he says that they regarded it as their Bible, I don't know that we can go on and conclude that they didn't regard the Hebrew texts that were alongside of them not as their Bible. So again, we have to think about this carefully, in my opinion. As I said earlier in response to one of the questions, I would suspect that the writers of the New Testament and the other members of the early church cited the Old Greek because they were primarily working in a Hellenistic milieu, and most of the people would have no direct access to Hebrew texts, and even if they did have access to them, probably didn't know how to read them or understand them. And so it becomes both a pragmatic issue as well as it were, a theological issue, if you want to put it that way. And as I said earlier, I think that they probably tended to regard both the Greek translation as well as the Hebrew text as somewhat equivalent in authority. And we're not prepared to make a distinction in authority between them. Now, the primary data we have prior to the New Testament writers is that Jewish people regarded the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms, and other books associated with David primarily as their collection of sacred texts. Now, I know there's a lot of discussion as to how formal that was and how widespread that was and so forth, and that it doesn't mean that there weren't other documents that could have been regarded as scripture. But the fact remains that there's this sort of triple language that emerges in Jewish texts themselves out of the 2nd and 1st century BCE that continually seem to reflect this kind of focus. So I think this suggests to us that if by Old Greek translation, Mueller is wanting to have an expanded canon that includes apocryphal material, and that becomes then the rationale for having this expanded Bible, if we could put it that way, used by the early church, I think it is problematic. So, in short, then, it seems to me what the early church regarded as their quote unquote Bible were texts primarily related to the Jewish sacred tradition. These were the texts that in the Synoptic Gospels Jesus accesses and uses to explain himself and his movement and so forth. And I think primarily in the documents written by his followers, this similarly is the case. And so if this is the reality, then I think we can say, yes, they regarded the Old Greek translations of these materials as their Bible, and it's certainly appropriate for Christians to use that material as their Bible today. But this doesn't mean that it is to be regarded as such in distinction from the validity of the Hebrew text as Bible. I would just, there's got to be some understanding of that relationship, I think. And then when we come to the question of Apocrypha and so forth, it again is difficult. We know the theological debates that go on about these materials and so forth. The fact is that some of these materials are dated into the middle of the 1st century CE, like 4th Maccabees and so forth. And it raises the question, would New Testament writers have regarded these documents that are contemporary with themselves as being in fact equally authoritative? We don't know that, right? And similarly, when we come to things like the additions to Esther or the materials associated with the Daniel sagas like Susanna or Bel and the Dragon, we don't know how New Testament writers would have understood that. Just because they're associated with texts in the Hebrew Bible that bear their names and so forth, doesn't mean necessarily that they were regarded with the same kind of authority and so forth, in my opinion. But again, we're getting into sort of dogmatic territory here a little bit, and I think we just have to recognize that. At the end of the day, I think we have to go back to the documents in the New Testament and ask, how did they access the Jewish sacred tradition? What were they quoting? With what text did they associate the formula that seemed to suggest authoritativeness and so forth? And on that basis, try to understand what they regarded as their Bible in order to get direction for ourselves today in terms of what we should regard as our Bible. So I think that's about as far as I'm prepared at this point to take it, because I think it's a very complex question.
Right. Well, thank you, Larry, for this discussion. So viewers who are interested in delving deeper into these issues can look up the course that will be taught by Larry this fall at ACTS Seminaries, and we'll have some information about that at the end of the video. And we hope that this discussion has been both stimulating and helpful to anyone interested in the New Testament and the Septuagint, and even more broadly into the issues concerning the use of the Old Testament in the New. Thank you, Larry.
You're welcome. It's been a delight to interact with you, and I trust that people will recognize that on these issues, there's a wide divergence of positions and understanding, and I respect that and hope that what I have suggested today will contribute to that discussion and dialogue about the use of the Septuagint in the New Testament.
Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.